For years, people thought they understood exactly what those films were about. The conversations, the headlines, and the reactions all seemed to point in one direction, shaping a narrative that became almost impossible to challenge. But everything shifted when Jamie Dornan finally addressed the controversy head-on. And in just a few words, he began to unravel a perception that had followed him for a long time. The films that sparked this debate were never quiet in their reception. They generated attention from the moment they were announced, drawing both curiosity and criticism in equal measure. Audiences formed opinions quickly, often before fully engaging with the story itself. And over time, those opinions solidified into a widely accepted view that didn't always reflect the intent behind the work. Jamie Dornan was at the center of it all, carrying not just the role, but the weight of how it was interpreted. As the face of a character that became synonymous with controversy, he found himself navigating questions that went far beyond performance. It wasn't just about acting anymore, it was about defending a perspective, about explaining what the films were meant to represent. And for a long time, that explanation remained largely unspoken. When he finally chose to respond, it wasn't with defensiveness or frustration, but with clarity. His statement, "We didn't make that kind of film," felt simple, almost understated, yet it carried a deeper meaning. It wasn't just a denial of how the films were labeled, it was a challenge to the way people had chosen to define them. And in that moment, the conversation shifted from assumption to intention. What makes his response so significant is how it reframes the entire narrative. Instead of focusing on surface-level elements, it invites a closer look at the storytelling itself. It suggests that what people saw and what was actually created might not be the same thing. And that difference, between perception and intention, is where the real complexity begins. For many viewers, the films were defined by their most talked about aspects. Those moments became the focus, overshadowing the broader themes and character dynamics that shaped the story. It's a common pattern in media: certain elements capture attention so strongly that they begin to represent the whole. And once that happens, it becomes difficult to see anything beyond that initial impression. Jamie's perspective challenges that pattern. It asks audiences to reconsider what they think they know, to look beyond the obvious and explore the context that surrounds it. Because storytelling is rarely one-dimensional, even when it's presented in a way that invites strong reactions. And when that complexity is overlooked, the result can be a narrative that feels incomplete. There's also a level of honesty in the way he approaches the topic. He doesn't attempt to dismiss the reactions entirely or suggest that they came from nowhere. Instead, he acknowledges that the films were received in a certain way, while also making it clear that this wasn't the intention behind them. That balance, between recognition and clarification, is what gives his statement its impact. As his words began to circulate, they sparked a new wave of discussion. Some people saw it as a necessary correction, a chance to rethink how the films had been categorized. Others viewed it more skeptically, questioning whether a single statement could truly change a perception that had been built over years. And in that divide, the conversation became even more layered. Because in the end, what Jamie Dornan said didn't provide a definitive answer, it opened a door. It created space for interpretation, for debate, and for a deeper understanding of how stories are perceived. And once that space exists, it becomes impossible to ignore the possibility that what people believed for so long might not be the full picture. And just like that, a narrative that once felt settled began to feel uncertain again. So what did he really mean when he said, "We didn't make that kind of film"? Because the more people thought about it, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a simple denial, it was a shift in perspective. It challenged audiences to separate what they expected from what was actually intended. And in doing so, it opened up a much deeper conversation about how stories are interpreted. At the heart of his statement is the idea that intention and perception don't always align. Filmmakers can approach a project with a specific vision, a certain tone, and a clear narrative goal. But once that project is released into the world, it no longer belongs entirely to them. It becomes something audiences interpret through their own experiences, expectations, and assumptions. And sometimes, that interpretation takes on a life of its own. In this case, the films became defined by the elements that generated the strongest reactions. Those aspects were highlighted, discussed, and repeated until they overshadowed everything else. Character development, emotional arcs, and the broader narrative were often pushed into the background, replaced by a more simplified understanding. And once that simplified version took hold, it became difficult to challenge. Jamie Dornan's response pushes back against that simplification. It suggests that there's more to the story than what was immediately visible, more than what people chose to focus on. It invites viewers to reconsider the films not as a single category, but as a layered narrative that includes emotion, conflict, and character growth. And that invitation is what makes his statement so significant. At the same time, it raises an important question about how audiences engage with controversial material. When a film includes elements that provoke strong reactions, those elements often become the focal point of discussion. They shape headlines, drive conversations, and influence how the entire project is perceived. But in focusing so heavily on those aspects, it's easy to lose sight of the context that gives them meaning. This is where the idea of what kind of film becomes more complex. Genres are often used as shortcuts, ways to quickly categorize and understand what we're watching. But not every story fits neatly into a single category. Some exist in a space between definitions, blending different elements in ways that challenge expectations. And when that happens, the risk of misunderstanding increases. Fan reactions to Jamie's comments have reflected that complexity. Some viewers have embraced his perspective, revisiting the films with a different mindset and noticing details they may have overlooked before. They see the characters in a new light, focusing on motivations and relationships rather than surface-level elements. And for them, his statement adds depth rather than taking anything away. Others, however, remain unconvinced. They argue that perception is just as important as intention, that once a film is experienced in a certain way, that experience can't simply be redefined. For them, the impact of the films is tied to how they were received, not just how they were meant to be understood. And that tension between creator intent and audience interpretation is what keeps the debate alive. What makes this situation so compelling is that both perspectives can exist at the same time. A film can be created with one intention and received in another, without either side being entirely wrong. It's a reminder that storytelling is a collaborative experience, shaped not just by those who create it, but by those who engage with it. And in that collaboration, meaning is constantly evolving. Jamie Dornan's statement doesn't close the conversation, it expands it. It encourages a more nuanced approach, one that looks beyond initial impressions and considers the broader context. And while it may not change everyone's perspective, it adds another layer to how the films are understood. In the end, the controversy isn't just about what was shown on screen, it's about how people chose to see it. And that choice is influenced by countless factors, from personal expectations to cultural context. So when Jamie says, "We didn't make that kind of film," he's not just defending the work, he's reminding audiences that there's always more beneath the surface. Because sometimes, the biggest misunderstanding isn't in the story itself, it's in the way we choose to interpret it. In the end, the controversy isn't just about what was shown on screen, it's about how people chose to see it. And that choice is influenced by countless factors, from personal expectations to cultural context. So when Jamie says, "We didn't make that kind of film," he's not just defending the work, he's reminding audiences that there's always more beneath the surface. Because sometimes, the biggest misunderstanding isn't in the story itself, it's in the way we choose to interpret it. Because sometimes, the biggest misunderstanding